In the final, turbulent stretch of the Second World War, when empires trembled and the fate of nations balanced on the edge of uncertainty, the skies over the Pacific held a silence that seemed unbreakable. Japan stood isolated behind thousands of miles of ocean, guarded by geography, distance, and the belief that no enemy fighter could pierce the vastness and reach the heart of the empire itself. For years, Japanese pilots watched foreign bombers pass high overhead, assuming that any fighter escorts would vanish long before the coastline appeared. It was an assurance built on logic, reinforced by strategy, and trusted by those who defended the homeland with dwindling resources and relentless determination. That certainty shattered in a single moment. When the first silver silhouettes of the P-51 Mustang appeared above Tokyo, racing at nearly 444 miles per hour with long-range drop tanks strapped beneath their wings, the balance of the war changed forever. These aircraft did not merely arrive, they materialized as a symbol of technological triumph, industrial might, and a strategic breakthrough no one had foreseen. In that instant, the vast protective void of the Pacific evaporated. The empire was no longer shielded by distance. The skies were no longer safe. For the Japanese pilots who launched to intercept them, the realization came swift and irreversible: an enemy had crossed the impossible. And nothing would ever be the same again. In the final years of the Second World War, as the conflict in Europe approached its inevitable conclusion and the Pacific struggle escalated into its most violent and decisive phase, few could have predicted the dramatic transformation that would occur in the skies over Japan. The empire had long believed that its home airspace remained beyond the reach of sustained American fighter presence, protected by vast distances of ocean and the limitations of enemy aircraft range. Japanese military planners, confident in the natural geographic buffer of the Pacific, considered high-speed escort fighters over Tokyo an impossibility, especially those capable of matching the velocity and altitude performance of the most advanced interceptors. For years, bomber formations and reconnaissance aircraft had been observed at extreme heights, but the idea that fast, heavily armed American fighters could cross the ocean, loiter in Japanese airspace, engage defenders, and return safely to distant island bases remained unthinkable. Yet this illusion would be shattered by the arrival of an aircraft that would redefine the strategic balance in the sky and rewrite aviation history: the North American P-51 Mustang, flying at speeds Japanese pilots had not anticipated, sweeping towards the capital at nearly 444 miles per hour with long-range drop tanks that extended their operational reach beyond anything the defenders had imagined possible. The story of how these Mustangs came to appear over Tokyo begins years earlier, rooted in a global conflict that rapidly evolved into a contest of technology, industrial capability, endurance, and the relentless development of advanced aviation engineering. When the war began, few could foresee the Mustang becoming one of the most decisive aircraft of the conflict. Its origins lay in an urgent request from the British Purchasing Commission, which demanded a new fighter capable of challenging German air superiority. The earliest Mustangs served primarily in reconnaissance and low-altitude attack roles, limited in performance by their engines. It was only when American engineers matched the airframe with the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that the P-51 evolved into a machine with unprecedented combination of high-altitude power, aerodynamic refinement, and long-range efficiency. The collaboration between British operational experience and American industrial innovation produced a fighter capable not only of escorting bombers deep into enemy territory, but also sustaining extended combat far from friendly bases. As Allied industrial production surged, the United States shifted its strategic priorities across two oceans, dedicating enormous logistical resources to the Pacific theater. While the European strategic bombing campaign was supported by a vast network of continental airfields, the Pacific imposed extreme constraints. Each operational movement, each squadron redeployment, each runway construction effort required overcoming distance, weather, and terrain that dwarfed anything experienced in Europe. The capture of island chains, from the Gilberts to the Marshalls to the Marianas, was driven not only by naval necessity, but by the urgent requirement for forward airbases capable of supporting strategic bomber operations. When U.S. forces seized the Marianas, they secured a foothold from which the B-29 superfortresses could launch attacks directly on the Japanese homeland. Yet these early missions exposed a lethal vulnerability. Without fighter escort, the bombers suffered severe losses to Japanese interceptors, anti-aircraft batteries, and the unforgiving operational realities of flying thousands of miles across the Pacific. American commanders searching for a fighter capable of escorting the B-29s across such distances focused increasingly on the Mustang. Its exceptional aerodynamic efficiency, combined with the ability to carry external fuel tanks, allowed it to exceed ranges once thought unattainable. Engineers reconfigured wing hardpoints, reinforced structural components, and integrated systems enabling extended cruise at optimal fuel consumption levels. The addition of drop tanks transformed the P-51 from a continental interceptor into a transoceanic escort platform, capable of departing from airstrips carved out of volcanic islands, climbing into formation with B-29s, escorting them through contested territory, engaging enemy fighters above the Japanese mainland, and returning with enough fuel margin to land safely back at base. This technological convergence marked the beginning of a new phase in the air war over Japan. The Japanese High Command recognized the threat posed by bomber raids, but initial assessments failed to anticipate that the Americans would soon field large numbers of long-range fighters capable of challenging the defenders directly over the capital. For decades, Japanese air doctrine emphasized tactical engagements in regional theaters, defensive intercept missions near key industrial zones, and commitment to aircraft designed for agility rather than endurance. Fighters such as the Mitsubishi A6M Zero demonstrated extraordinary maneuverability, yet they lacked the ruggedness, armament, survivability, and performance required to counter fast, heavily armed American escorts at altitude. As resource shortages increased and industrial capacity diminished under continuous bombardment, Japan struggled to field next-generation interceptors in sufficient numbers. Maintenance crews faced shortages of fuel, replacement parts, tools, and trained personnel. Pilots underwent abbreviated training as losses mounted. Airfields were repeatedly damaged by strikes, further complicating aircraft readiness. Amid these deteriorating circumstances, the Mustang units preparing to strike Japan trained rigorously for the mission ahead. On remote Pacific airstrips, ground crews worked under extreme heat, torrential rain, and the ever-present threat of enemy attack to ensure each aircraft operated at peak performance. Mechanics meticulously inspected engines for signs of wear, balanced propellers, checked coolant systems, synchronized guns, and verified the integrity of drop tank fittings. Fuel logistics teams calculated consumption rates across varying altitudes and loadouts, adjusting mission plans based on weather forecasts, jet stream patterns, and anticipated enemy resistance. Pilots studied maps, memorized approach vectors, identified coastal landmarks, and developed tactics for navigation over vast expanses of open water where a forced landing meant near certain loss of aircraft and crew. Their preparation reflected not only technical precision, but a deep understanding of the unprecedented stakes of the mission. When the first P-51s appeared over Tokyo in force, Japanese pilots experienced profound shock. Reports describe interceptors climbing desperately to intercept the incoming formations, only to find the Mustangs arriving at speeds few had imagined possible while simultaneously demonstrating remarkable endurance. The defenders, long accustomed to intercepting bombers with only brief engagements before fuel limitations forced withdrawal, now faced an adversary capable of maintaining presence over their own capital. The Mustangs dove, climbed, banked, and accelerated with decisive energy, striking targets of opportunity, engaging defenders, and circling above burning industrial districts as the bombers continued their strikes. For the first time, Japanese pilots faced the daunting realization that the Americans not only could strike the homeland repeatedly, but could also suppress aerial resistance directly where it mattered most. The psychological impact of this development cannot be overstated. For years, Japan maintained the belief that its skies remained partially secure, that while bombers could inflict damage, fighter defense could impose cost and preserve dignity. The sudden arrival of high-performance escorts shattered this perception. The presence of Mustangs over Tokyo signaled more than a shift in tactical capability, it revealed a profound transformation in the balance of power. These fighters represented not merely machines of war, but the culmination of industrial might, technological advancement, strategic foresight, and logistical mastery on a scale unprecedented in aviation history. For Japanese pilots, who had once dominated the skies of the Pacific, this moment represented the realization that the war had entered a phase from which recovery would be impossible. The air battles that followed unfolded in the shadow of a nation under increasing strain. Factories struggled to replace lost aircraft. Fuel reserves dwindled as maritime supply lines collapsed under relentless submarine and aerial attack. Training institutions could no longer produce pilots with experience equivalent to those lost in earlier campaigns. Veterans who had survived years of combat bore the weight of accumulated loss, fatigue, and grief. Yet they continued to take to the air, aware that the odds no longer favored them, driven by duty, honor, and loyalty to comrades and homeland. Against this backdrop, the Mustangs continued to expand their operational role, establishing air superiority over the capital and its surrounding regions. They intercepted transport aircraft, suppressed defensive installations, destroyed grounded fighters, and supported increasingly frequent bombing missions. As the months passed, residents of Tokyo observed new sounds overhead, distinct from the deep thunder of bomber formations. The high-pitched roar of liquid-cooled V-12 engines signaled the presence of fighters once thought too distant to reach their skies. Survivors recalled looking upward to see sleek silhouettes passing overhead at extraordinary speed, their wings bearing the distinct shape that would become symbolic of Allied dominance in the latter months of the war. The sight left lasting memories among those who lived through the era, memories of a turning point that signaled impending and unavoidable change. In the midst of these dramatic developments, the evolution of the Mustang continued. Engineers refined cooling systems, optimized fuel consumption, and increased ammunition capacity. Operational commanders studied after-action reports, adjusting formation strategies, engagement priorities, and mission objectives to maximize the aircraft's capabilities. With each sortie, the American presence grew stronger and the Japanese defense weaker. The strategic implications became undeniable. The Empire could no longer protect its own airspace, its industrial infrastructure, or its civilian population from continuous assault. The very presence of the Mustang above Tokyo symbolized a profound inversion of control, one that foreshadowed the approaching end of the conflict. As the strategic bombing campaign intensified and the defenses of the Japanese mainland began to fracture under continuous pressure, the presence of Mustang squadrons in the skies above Tokyo became increasingly defining. What had begun as a shocking incursion soon transformed into a recurring demonstration of Allied dominance, a signal that the momentum of the war had shifted irreversibly. The P-51 units no longer represented an unexpected threat but a persistent presence, an ever-growing force that reshaped the rhythm of life across the Japanese homeland. Every raid, every formation, every high-altitude patrol carved deeper into the strategic vulnerabilities of the Empire. The aircraft that had once been considered incapable of reaching Japan were now returning again and again, each mission refining tactics and expanding objectives. The psychological effect was profound. For civilians, industry workers, and defenders alike, the sound of those engines symbolized a future rapidly closing in. As the weeks unfolded, the Mustangs took on roles far beyond simple escort duty. They became instruments of strategic interdiction, striking rail networks, fuel depots, shipyards, and airfields with precision previously unattainable at such range. They traversed the skies over shattered industrial districts, pursued stragglers fleeing to secondary bases, hunted reconnaissance flights, and isolated defensive sectors by severing logistical veins critical to sustaining Japan's war machine. Each sortie compounded the operational strain on the defenders. Maintenance crews working from compromised airfields could no longer guarantee the readiness of aircraft. Shortages of aviation gasoline forced commanders into impossible choices. Veteran pilots, once revered for their mastery, were increasingly deployed alongside hastily trained replacements whose first combat mission might become their last. The Americans, meanwhile, approached this phase of the conflict with disciplined foresight. Mustang squadrons refined formation techniques, maximizing defensive cohesion and offensive reach. Wingmen adapted to fluid combat conditions, transitioning seamlessly between escort, suppression, reconnaissance, and strike missions. Navigation officers studied Pacific atmospheric patterns, refining flight paths to exploit jet streams and minimize fuel expenditure. Intelligence teams tracked Japanese unit movements, analyzing interceptor performance, sortie rates, and attrition curves. Every report deepened the understanding of a deteriorating adversary. Commanders understood that gaining control of the skies was no longer an aspiration, it was a necessity for concluding the conflict on terms acceptable to the Allied command. In this environment, the Mustang forged a reputation that transcended mere engineering excellence. To the American crews, it became a symbol of the distance they had traveled, both geographically and emotionally. Pilots who had once flown over the skies of France or Germany now found themselves navigating the vast Pacific corridor, knowing each mission expanded the influence of Allied airpower across a region once thought invulnerable. Ground crews labored through exhaustion, heat, illness, and uncertainty to ensure the aircraft remained worthy of the tasks ahead. Each maintenance cycle reflected a deep sense of responsibility, for everyone involved understood that the success of the campaign depended not on a single system, but on the coordinated effort of thousands united by purpose. Japanese pilots faced an increasingly desperate struggle. In the early stages of the war, they had flown with confidence rooted in mastery, training, and innovation. They had witnessed spectacular victories across the Pacific, successes that defined the nation's early wartime identity. Yet by the time the Mustangs appeared overhead, the tides had reversed. Instead of dictating combat terms, they found themselves reacting, fighting with diminishing resources, confronted by a foe whose momentum grew with each engagement. The emotional burden on these airmen was immense. They fought for homeland, family, memory, and duty, knowing that every flight carried the weight of national survival. And yet, for all their will, the circumstances were no longer in their favor. The Mustang pilots, too, were shaped by these missions. Many of them carried memories of comrades lost in Europe, others were driven by the knowledge that their actions would hasten the end of a devastating conflict. They recognized that each sortie served not only tactical objectives, but strategic imperatives that would alter the trajectory of history. The skies over Tokyo became the arena where the war's final act began to take form, not in isolation but as part of a global struggle whose outcomes would reverberate across generations. The contrast between opposing air forces grew sharper as the months progressed. On one side stood the industrial strength of a nation unshaken by strikes against its homeland, capable of producing machines of extraordinary endurance and performance, supported by extensive supply chains and continuous refinement. On the other stood a nation grappling with scarcity, destruction, and the relentless collapse of its infrastructure, fighting not merely battles but the cumulative weight of exhaustion. The Mustangs symbolized this imbalance. Wherever they flew, they carried with them the unmistakable conclusion that the war was moving toward its decisive endpoint. As Allied strategy integrated the Mustang into increasingly broader operations, Japanese leadership found itself with dwindling options. Aircraft reserves shrank. Production facilities lay shattered or paralyzed. Fuel depots burned. Ports struggled under blockade. The air war no longer represented a contest over dominance, it represented the final struggle to delay the inevitable. And through all of this, the Mustangs continued to fly. Their presence became the new rhythm of the skies, the defining sound of a changing era, the unmistakable indicator that the Pacific conflict had entered a phase from which no retreat was possible. Their arrival, once shocking, became symbolic. Their return, once unlikely, became certain. Their endurance, once unimaginable, became fate. As the strategic balance shifted irreversibly, the transformation underway in the skies above Japan revealed not only the power of the Mustang as a machine of war, but also the far-reaching implications of its presence. The aircraft served as a living testament to the evolution of conflict, where range, endurance, and speed became instruments of decisive influence. Each mission expanded Allied capability, and each successful sortie affirmed the collapse of the defensive perimeter upon which Japan had once relied. Over time, the Mustang flights ceased to be seen as intrusions and instead became harbingers of a new phase of history, signaling the unraveling of a conflict defined by ambition, sacrifice, and steadfast perseverance. The very sight of these fighters crossing the coastline marked a profound shift. The war had reached the heart of the empire, and the skies no longer belonged to those who had once claimed mastery over them. Through each wave of operations, Japanese pilots rose to meet the challenge with tenacity born not of confidence, but of obligation. They confronted an adversary whose strength multiplied while their own resources diminished. Airfields that had once thrived with disciplined regiments and abundant supplies stood scarred by craters, surrounded by obsolete equipment, and maintained by exhausted crews. The complexity of defending the home islands intensified with each passing month. Engines sputtered with inferior fuel. Replacement parts arrived sporadically or not at all. Training programs compressed into weeks what had once taken years. Yet despite these mounting burdens, Japanese aviators continued to ascend into skies increasingly dominated by the polished silhouettes of Mustangs, knowing that few missions would end in triumph, and many might not end at all. On the Allied side, the campaign became a relentless test of endurance. The great distances that separated bases from battlefields demanded unbroken focus. Pilots navigated unpredictable winds at altitude, contended with weather systems that stretched across the Pacific, and balanced the ever-present threat of mechanical failure. They carried not only ammunition and fuel, but the responsibility of securing the future for countless soldiers, sailors, and civilians whose lives depended on the success of their missions. To many, each sortie represented more than a combat assignment. It symbolized the culmination of years of shared sacrifice, the convergence of industrial innovation, and the expression of collective resolve. Every successful return to base reinforced the knowledge that victory came not from single engagements, but from the unyielding accumulation of effort across continents and oceans. As the American air offensive intensified, Japanese cities bore witness to devastation on a scale previously unimaginable. Industrial centers were reduced to ruins. Transportation networks collapsed beneath the steady destruction of critical routes. Military communications faltered. Supply depots vanished beneath towering plumes of smoke. And above these sprawling fires, the Mustang circled, watching, guarding, and striking, embodying the relentless closure of a war that had cost so many lives across so many lands. Survivors spoke of the contrast between the rolling thunder of bombers and the sudden, piercing roar of the P-51 engines, symbols of change sweeping across the archipelago. By the summer of 1945, the Mustang had become the dominant force over the Japanese homeland. Its presence ensured that every mission flown by American bombers reached its objective with growing certainty. Escort operations turned into sweeps of near-complete air superiority. No longer confined to the edge of battle, the Mustangs now flew directly through the heart of conflict. From dawn missions over urban industrial hubs to dusk patrols guarding returning B-29 formations, they marked transitions between eras. Their pilots understood that they were living inside the final chapter of a global struggle, a chapter written not only in military terms, but in human ones. For those on the ground, that chapter was experienced with gravity and sorrow. Families sought shelter. Workers attempted to rebuild. Communities tended to wounded cities, even as they braced for the next wave. The skies had become a reminder of how deeply the war had reached into civilian life, how profoundly the course of nations had shifted, and how rapidly the world was changing around them. Veterans of earlier campaigns recognized that they were witnessing the collapse of a belief once held as immovable, that the homeland remained protected by distance and the strength of its warriors. Finally, as the conflict drew toward its decisive conclusion, the Mustang's role transitioned once more. With air superiority assured, the aircraft became a symbol not of destruction alone, but of transformation. Its very presence marked the end of one age and the awakening of another. The same technology that once embodied lethal precision would, in the years to come, help usher in a new definition of flight, innovation, and cooperation. The pilots who flew these missions would return home bearing not only memories of war, but the responsibility of safeguarding peace. The machine that once crossed oceans to engage in war would become an icon of what aviation could achieve in peacetime. In the final days, as Japan prepared for surrender, the Mustang soared over a nation exhausted by years of conflict. Its shadow passed over cities forever altered. Its engines echoed across landscapes marked by loss. And yet, in its path lay not only destruction, but the end of destruction. The long journey of the war, measured in distance, sacrifice, and time, reached its conclusion. When peace was declared, the Mustang's presence over Tokyo became something more than a memory of war. For those who survived, it became a defining moment in life itself. A reminder of vulnerability, of courage, of turning points, and of irrevocable change. Many decades later, those who lived through that era would remember the first time they saw the Mustangs approach the capital, their speed, their grace, their unexpected arrival. They would recall how the world shifted in that moment, how certainty dissolved and history accelerated. And even as years passed, the memory of that sight would remain, vivid and enduring. In the reflection of time, the P-51's arrival over Tokyo symbolized not simply military prowess, but the extraordinary reach of human innovation, the resilience of nations under trial, and the profound cost required to bring an era of war to its end. It became a testament to all who served on every front, in every role, under every flag, shaped by hope and loss in equal measure. The war closed. The skies fell silent. And the Mustangs, engines cooling on distant island runways, stood as witness that the world had forever changed.